Welcome to the Hindu Daily.
Glad to be here for another deep dive.
So we have a really fascinating journey for you today. We're sequentially unpacking 8 distinct sources from today's newspaper, and we're starting in the editorial section, then moving through opinions, science, text, and context, and finally ending up in the foreign section.
Right, and as we go through these, you're going to notice this really powerful, overarching theme connecting everything.
Yeah, it's all about control and definitions, right? Like, how do rules, institutions, and the very definitions we use actually shape our reality? We are exploring that urge to categorize and control across, well, everything, from microscopic quantum particles to global trade, judicial authority, and even the brutal realities of war.
It's a heavy lineup, but it really ties together.
It does. Okay, let's unpack this first piece from the editorial section. Imagine a referee in a high-stakes World Cup match, right? They blow the whistle, stop the game, pull out the official rule book, and just completely tear out the page on the offside rule right there on the pitch.
Just ripping it right out.
Exactly. And why? Just because a player complained about one of their calls? I mean, that sounds entirely absurd, but it's remarkably close to a dynamic we're seeing unfold in India's highest court today.
Yeah, what's fascinating here is the sheer scope of the Supreme Court's recent move. They directed a complete blanket ban on a Class 8 social science textbook passage.
Right.
And the context of that banned passage is what makes this so striking. It simply referenced, judicial corruption and the massive backlog of cases in Indian courts.
Which is, common knowledge at this point.
Exactly. But the court didn't just order the book pulled from classrooms. They mandated that the people who prepared these passages be disassociated from future projects entirely.
Instantly.
Right, instantly, with zero hearing or due process.
That is exactly where that referee analogy hits hardest. Like, if constitutional courts are the absolute last resort for you and me to safeguard our fundamental rights...
Like freedom of speech under Article 19.
Right, exactly. Who watches the watchman when the court itself becomes the book banner?
It really highlights this massive tension between institutional suppression and structural reform. I mean, the textbook passage they banned, it specifically referenced things like the Bangalore principles of judicial conduct.
Which were drafted back in 2002, right? And they're essentially the global gold standard for how judges should behave.
Yeah.
Principles like independence, integrity, impartiality.
Right. And merely referencing those principles, noting empirical case backlogs, that doesn't automatically meet the high legal threshold for criminal contempt.
Because for contempt of court, you typically need to prove malicious intent, right? Like a deliberate attempt to scandalize the judiciary.
Exactly. Banning a book without that proven intent is arguably the most severe form of censorship. But there is another way institutions can handle criticism. If you look at Kenya's judicial reforms between 2011 and 2013, under their Chief Justice, Willy Mutunga.
They took the exact opposite approach, didn't they?
Totally opposite.
Instead of banning criticism, they leaned all the way into it.
They blew the doors wide open. They established judicial ombudspersons to investigate complaints. They created these court users committees to get direct feedback from citizens. And they openly acknowledged the rot and corruption in their system on national television.
Wow. And the result of that transparency?
It was massive. Public trust in the Kenyan judiciary skyrocketed from a dismal 27% in 2009 to 61% by 2013.
That's incredible. So a court that continuously reforms itself, rather than using its sheer authority to just suppress dissent, is the actual bedrock of a democracy.
Yeah, because when an institution outlaws criticism to enforce respect, it usually just broadcasts its own deep insecurity.
That is so true. But, that urge to enforce control when an institution feels threatened, it isn't just a domestic issue. We're seeing the exact same crisis of authority playing out on the global stage right now.
Right, in the international trade arena.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Also, in today's editorial section, we're looking at the World Trade Organization, specifically the upcoming ministerial conference, MC14, in Cameroon. And the WTO is essentially paralyzed.
Completely gridlocked.
To use another analogy, it feels like a massive 166-player online game where the server is lagging so badly that the most powerful players have just decided to make up their own ad hoc rules to keep playing.
That's a great way to put it. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the lag is systemic. The dispute settlement system, which is literally the beating heart of the WTO, is completely frozen.
Because the appellate body appointments have been stalled, right?
Exactly. Stalled for years by member blockades. So when a country appeals a trade dispute now, The case essentially goes into a void because there are no judges to hear it. It's basically a zombie court.
And plus, their core rules are stuck in the past. I mean, they barely cover digital commerce, which is what drives the modern economy. So instead of a unified rulebook, we're seeing the rise of what the article calls wrecking ball politics. Countries are using tariffs not as standard economic tools, but as geopolitical weapons to punish rivals.
Yeah, the tariffs become a weapon.
But let me challenge the instinct to save this institution for a second. With 166 members at vastly different stages of development, is the WTO simply too big and cumbersome to ever reach a consensus again?
It's a fair question.
I mean, you have to admit, letting the heavyweights just make their own efficient bilateral deals is incredibly tempting.
You're completely right that the consensus model is painfully slow, and yeah, it's currently broken. Bilateral deals are definitely faster. But abandoning the WTO system entirely is incredibly dangerous, particularly for smaller, poorer countries.
Because without a global referee, the biggest kids on the playground just take everyone's lunch money.
Precisely. In an era of intense strategic competition, multilateral rules don't weaken a nation's sovereignty. They're actually the only shield vulnerable nations have against outright economic domination.
Oh, that makes sense.
If that binding dispute resolution system completely collapses, we replace the rule of law with the rule of power. And ad hoc transactional deals, they always favor the heavyweights who can just dictate the terms.
Right.
So reforming the WTO isn't just about, figuring out how to tax a digital download. It's about ensuring global trade remains predictable and doesn't just evolve into pure economic coercion.
That transition from an old system to a new reality is jarring, and if you don't adapt, you get left behind, which actually leads us perfectly to the opinion section.
Yeah.
We are seeing a similarly massive systemic transition right here in India, but it's happening quietly in the background of our population data.
Yeah, we're looking at India moving out of its famous youth dividend and transitioning into a silver economy.
So what does this all mean? The numbers projected between 2021 and 2051 are staggering. The pre-primary school-going population.
So kids age 0 to 4.
Right. That group is expected to plummet from over 113.5 million down to just 8.6 million by the middle of the century.
It's an absolute demographic earthquake.
It really is. We are already seeing tens of thousands of government schools closing because they're deemed uneconomic, while private school enrollment rises.
Meanwhile, the median age in India is projected to climb from 28 up to 40.
But wait, let me push back on this. We hear constantly about India's youth bulge being this unstoppable, infinite economic engine. Is this data essentially saying the engine is running out of gas much faster than we realized?
This raises an important question, actually. The engine isn't dead, but the window of maximum acceleration is definitely closing. The demographic dividend.
That sweet spot where a massive chunk of your population is working age.
Exactly, compared to dependents. That spot is projected to peak around 2041 before it starts to sharply decline.
So the urgency to capitalize on it is very real right now.
It is. But, it's not a doom and gloom scenario if the infrastructure adapts. The source outlines 2 major solutions to offset this shift. First, unlocking a gender dividend.
Right, getting more women working.
Yeah, right now, cultural and structural hurdles keep female workforce participation entirely too low. Bringing far more women into the formal workforce immediately expands that economic engine.
And the second solution is fundamentally changing how we view the aging population itself, isn't it?
Exactly. Instead of viewing older citizens purely as a medical burden on geriatric care, the economy needs to treat them as a thriving silver economy.
Like a new market.
Right. If India redesigns its infrastructure now, creating financial products for retirees, accessible public transport, new consumer markets tailored to older adults, it can actually unlock a second demographic dividend.
That's fascinating. Monitoring these demographic shifts is crucial for our economic survival. But if we shift gears to the science section, researchers are warning us about a silent demographic collapse happening right under our feet in the natural world.
Yeah, we're talking about the global decline of amphibians, specifically frogs.
Frogs are basically the essential middle managers of the food web. They take all that insect biomass, the bugs eating the plants and crops, and convert it into vertebrate biomass, so bigger predators like birds and snakes can eat them.
They're a crucial link.
Right. So if they disappear, it is exactly like removing middle management in a corporation. The whole ladder of the ecosystem collapses. You get a trophic cascade, a massive boom in crop-destroying insects and disease-carrying mosquitoes, and a total crash in the predators that rely on frogs for food.
And globally, They are being wiped out by a combination of climate change, habitat loss, and this terrifying fungus called chytridiomycosis.
Which sounds like a spell from a fantasy novel, but it's incredibly lethal.
Mhm.
How does a fungus actually cause a mass die-off?
Well, it attacks the keratin in their skin. Because frogs are amphibians, they essentially breathe and absorb vital water and salts through their highly permeable skin.
Oh,
Yeah, so this fungus thickens that skin, causing a severe osmotic imbalance that effectively suffocates them and triggers cardiac arrest.
yeah.
It's completely devastated populations in the Americas and Australia.
But looking at the Indian context, we have over 450 species of amphibians, and many are just labeled data deficient. If we haven't actually documented those kind of mass die-offs here yet, aren't we jumping the gun? Isn't it highly possible they're fine and we just aren't looking in the right places?
It's tempting to hope for that, but data deficient absolutely does not mean safe. It simply means we have a massive scientific blind spot.
Okay.
While the fungus hasn't caused identical mass mortality in India yet, scientists haven't seen frog populations naturally improve either. And what's worse, climate change is creating false environmental cues that act like an evolutionary trap. It bypasses the fungus entirely.
False cues, like confusing their internal biological clocks.
Exactly. Imagine an early, intense monsoon shower in the Western Ghats. That triggers the frogs into a massive breeding frenzy. They lay their eggs in the newly formed puddles. But because the climate is erratic, that early rain is followed by a prolonged, unseasonal dry spell.
Oh no, so the puddles dry up entirely before the tadpoles can even develop.
And it leads to a catastrophic breeding failure for that entire generation. Because frogs have such short lifespans, mistiming that rain by even a few weeks is utterly devastating to the local population.
But there is a very practical way for you listening to actually help fix this blind spot. Because there's such a lack of long-term data, citizen science is filling the gap, right?
Absolutely. Initiatives like the Mapping Malabar Tree Toad Project rely on everyday people.
You can literally just record frog calls on your smartphone or take photos during the monsoon and upload them to portals like iNaturalist. You are directly helping scientists build the robust data they desperately need to track this hidden crisis.
And, that urge to categorize and define isn't just a biological tool for tracking frogs. It's a fundamental human reflex to understand reality. In fact, physicists at CERN are doing the exact same thing right now, trying to define the literal building blocks of existence.
Sticking with the science section, this takes us from muddy streams to the Large Hadron Collider in Europe.
Okay, let's unpack this. They are smashing invisible matter together at the speed of light, and they just discovered their 80th new particle, named the GC plus Baryon.
It's a mouthful.
It is. And it's made of 2 charm quarks and 1 down quark. Yeah, I always have to laugh at this. Physicists decided quarks come in flavors like up, down, charm, strange, top and bottom. It sounds like the menu at a highly eccentric ice cream shop.
It definitely strips away some of the intimidation of quantum physics, doesn't it?
Right. But the reality of this particle is intense. It's 4 times heavier than a normal proton. But my pushback here is about practical relevance.
This particle's lifespan is up to 6 times shorter than its counterpart. We are talking about something that exists for just a microscopic fraction of a blink before it decays. How does spending billions of dollars to find a particle that disappears almost instantly actually impact our understanding of reality?
What's fascinating here is that tiny fraction of a blink is actually enough time to test the very laws of physics. Normal protons, the stuff that makes up you and me, they have 2 up quarks and 1 down quark.
Okay.
The exotic particle CERN found back in 2017 had 2 charm quarks and 1 up quark. This new one just swaps that single up for a down.
And that single flavor swap changes how long it lives.
Drastically.
Yeah.
And by observing exactly how fast it decays, scientists achieved a statistical significance of 7 sigma.
Which basically means the odds of this observation being a random statistical fluke are less than 1 in 390 billion, right? It's an absolute certainty.
Exactly. That extreme precision allows them to stress test quantum chromodynamics. That's the mathematical theory explaining the strong force.
Strong force.
Yeah, think of it like microscopic, incredibly tight cosmic bungee cords holding the quarks together to form protons and neutrons. It has to be immensely strong to overcome the natural repulsion of positively charged particles.
I see.
By watching exactly how quickly this new, heavier particle snaps apart, scientists can measure the exact tension of those bungee cords.
So if that strong force bungee cord wasn't tuned exactly the way it is, atoms wouldn't hold together. Nuclear fusion in stars wouldn't happen. The Earth, the microphone I'm speaking into, neither of us would even exist.
Precisely. Studying this fleeting, invisible particle is essentially checking the foundational math of our own existence.
Wow. From the rigid mathematical definitions of fundamental physical particles, we pivot to a much more complex and contested space in the text and context section. How the state attempts to define human identity itself.
We're examining the proposed 2026 amendment bill to the Transgender Persons Protection of Rights Act.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The shift here is massive. Back in 2014, the landmark Nalelsa judgment by the Supreme Court was a watershed moment. It ruled that self-determination of your gender is an integral part of personal autonomy.
Right.
It affirmed psychological sex over biological sex as a deeply personal right. But this new 2026 bill completely revokes the right to a self-perceived gender identity.
It's a complete reversal of that 2014 framework.
Instead, it requires a government medical board to certify a person. It relies strictly on biological characteristics, medical conditions, and specific sociocultural terms like hedra or kinner to define who qualifies.
The government's administrative logic, which they outlined in their Statement of Objects and Reasons, is that the old law was simply too vague to enforce properly.
Right. They claim this highly precise medicalized definition is necessary to ensure that vast state benefits and welfare quotas reach genuinely oppressed persons without the system being exploited by bad actors. And looking at it purely from a bureaucratic standpoint, isn't there a logistical logic to their argument? The state needs a verifiable metric to know exactly who it is serving and to prevent fraud.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, from a purely administrative standpoint, yes, the state always prioritizes legibility. It wants clear, measurable categories. But what we're actually seeing here is a massive philosophical shift away from a rights-based framework.
Oh, so?
Well, under Article 21 of the Constitution, which guarantees the right to life and personal liberty, your identity was recognized as your own inherent truth.
And under this new bill, it becomes a status conditionally granted by the state.
Precisely. It moves to a rigid, medicalized framework where the state grants your identity based on anatomical or chromosomal guidelines. Activists and community leaders argue this creates profound, damaging exclusion.
Because it leaves people out.
Yeah, for instance, the new definition explicitly excludes persons with different sexual orientations and self-perceived sexual identities. It forces individuals who fought decades for social recognition back into a space where a government medical board becomes the ultimate, unquestionable arbiter of who they are.
So the core tension is between the state's desperate need for administrative legibility and the individual's fundamental human right to bodily autonomy.
Exactly. And this struggle over who gets to define identity and what specific terminology is used to legitimize it perfectly mirrors another ongoing debate covered in today's text and context section.
Which is how we define our national identity through symbols.
Right.
So what does this all mean? We are looking at the recent controversy involving cricketer Hardik Pandya, who had a police complaint filed against him for allegedly insulting the national flag during World Cup celebrations. The controversy itself is really just a launchpad to explore the deep history of the flag. We tend to treat the tricolor flag and the national anthem as these ancient, eternal truths that just fell from the sky fully formed.
When in reality, they were heavily workshopped, debated, and iterated over decades of struggle.
It's almost like watching a startup trying to find its perfect logo.
That's actually a great analogy.
Right. You had the 1907 Calcutta flag with lotuses. Then Sister Nivedita, who was an Irish disciple of Swami Vivekananda, she designed a flag featuring a Vajra, or thunderbolt. And finally, Pingali Venkaya's design with the charkha, or spinning wheel, which was championed by Gandhi.
This raises an important question about that visual evolution because it maps directly onto the evolution of national consciousness. The early designs relied heavily on religious and spiritual symbols to stir the masses.
But as the freedom movement grew, the symbols had to become more inclusive.
Yes. The spinning wheel was a brilliant pivot because it wasn't just a symbol. It represented a tangible economic program of self-reliance against British textiles.
It united people across religious divides because everyone understood the value of economic freedom.
Exactly. And we see a similar evolution with the national song. Bankim Chandra Chatterjee's Vande Mataram was a powerful cry for freedom, but Rabindranath Tagore famously objected to it functioning as the sole national anthem because of its heavy reliance on goddess Durga imagery.
Because Tagore felt that would alienate Muslim citizens who strictly do not worship idols.
Right.
So that specific theological pension is what paved the way for the more universally inclusive Jana Gana Mana to become the national anthem.
It proves that national identity isn't static. It requires constant mediation and debate to ensure it represents all its people. It's fascinating to remember that it wasn't even until the Naveen Jindal case in 2004 that citizens secured the fundamental right to actually fly the national flag themselves.
Oh, really?
Yeah, for decades, that core symbol of identity was legally restricted by the state. An industrialist had to fight a decade-long court battle just to hoist it at his own factory.
That is wild to think about now. But when national identity and ideology become the absolute, uncompromising lens through which a state views the world, it often leads to a highly militarized mindset. And that brings us to our final piece today in the foreign section.
We're analyzing an interview with Israeli journalist Gideon Levy discussing Israel's current multi-front wars in Gaza, Lebanon, and Iran. Levy provides a really stark internal critique of his own country's policies and mindset.
Okay, let's unpack this. Levy is deeply critical of what he calls Israel's decapitation strategy, the constant, targeted assassination of opposition military and political leaders. To use an analogy, he views it like a grim, incredibly destructive game of whack-a-mole.
Yeah.
Every leader you strike down is simply replaced by someone even more radicalized by the violence.
He argues that diplomacy, particularly regarding frameworks like the Iran nuclear deal, was always the more effective long-term route for regional stability.
But let me challenge Levy's stance here. He advocates for diplomacy, but Israel is currently facing what the article describes as a literal ring of fire proxy groups, actively firing missiles from multiple borders simultaneously. In that specific, highly volatile geopolitical reality, isn't a hardline military response the only language that is actually understood? Diplomacy requires a willing partner.
It's a very pragmatic question, and what's fascinating here is how Levy addresses it by looking at the domestic cost. He doesn't deny the physical immediate threat of the Ring of Fire, but he argues that treating the military option as the first option rather than the absolute last option is internally degrading Israeli society.
How so? By normalizing the constant violence.
By fostering an aggressive, deeply militaristic mindset where an astonishing 93 to 94% of the domestic public currently supports the wars, his core argument is that all this overwhelming military force entirely ignores the root cause of the regional instability, which is the Palestinian question.
Right, the fact that millions of people are displaced, living in devastated conditions, while the political prospect of a two-state solution has been completely abandoned by the current leadership.
Exactly. For Levy, these military tactical wins like successful assassinations, they provide a dangerous illusion of security.
Because it's temporary.
They might stop a rocket today, but they do absolutely nothing to solve the underlying human crisis and dispossession that guarantees the next cycle of war tomorrow. The state is trying to bomb its way to a permanent definition of security, but without addressing the human reality on the ground, it's just perpetuating the conflict.
Across all these deep dives today, from a constitutional court censoring a textbook to protect its image, to a state using medical boards to redefine gender, to nations locked in perpetual defining wars, we see a recurring human desire to control the narrative. The question for you to mull over is this. When institutions try to forcefully define reality, whether they do it through legal clauses, book bans, or dropping bombs, do they actually create lasting order? Or do they just plant the seeds for future, much more volatile disruption? Thank you for listening. If you want to provide suggestions, please contact on the Twitter handle given in the episode description. As always, we are eager to hear what our listeners want to be informed about. We wish you a great day.